So I guess the final kind of miscellaneous things to talk about would be figuring out the cost of resin, actually the cost of doing a specific project. So, and also figuring out what kind of resin you want to buy. So this is really only geared towards if you're wanting to make things to sell, but also if you're on a budget, it kind of helps. So essentially, the rule I go by is cost per milliliter. So, and the reason I do that is because, some resin, like a gallon, like a half gallon of each part, comes out to a gallon of resin. Typically, resin is going to be cheaper in bulk. So if I buy a small kit, which this is just kind of, I poured these from a different resin, but a small kit about this size, like 16 ounces, 32 ounces of resin, that's going to be a little more expensive, and per milliliter. Now you can probably get a kit like this for 10 to 20, sometimes up to $30, whereas a kit with a gallon you can get for $40 to $60, as cheap as that, which may seem like a lot, but when you factor in the price per milliliter of resin, it's actually cheaper to go in bulk most of the time. The way to figure that out is to look at how much resin you've got in there. Now this doesn't tell me milliliters in here, but a quick Google search, or if you got a calculator that does conversions to metric, because for this you want to use metric to be as precise as possible. All you got to do is figure out how many milliliters are in the total combined two parts. So how many, in this case, how many milliliters are in a gallon, which I forget what that number is exactly. But you'll want to take that number and obviously, no, sorry, you'll want to take the price you paid for the resin. So say it's $50 for your whole kit of resin. You'll want to take that 50 and divide that by the number of milliliters of resin that comes with it. So say you've got 50, you paid $50 for it, and you've got like 1,000 milliliters. I got to get the calculator for this. So you've got 1,000 milliliters of resin. So take your calculator. That's a calendar, not a calculator. So we're going to take our $50, divide that by our, we'll say 3,000, because that's a little closer to what it would be. 3,000 milliliters. And that gives you 0.016. So in American dollars, 3,000 milliliters of resin at $50, that would cost me just 1.6 cents per milliliter. And the reason you want to add it up like that is, so say I want to figure out how much it costs me to make this. So then I take that 1.6 cents per milliliter that I had, then I just multiply it by how many milliliters I'm using for this project. And then that gives you the cost of this project. And of course, if you're using additives, glitter or mica powder or any pigment or whatever, you'll have to kind of figure out maybe an estimate to factor that stuff in to get your absolute cost. But the resin is always going to be, well, typically going to be the most expensive part of it. So that's kind of the fundamental pricing situation you want to get figured out. Now, continuing with that, what do I recommend? Like, what brand do I recommend for resin? I haven't used a super vast amount, vastly different amount of brands of resin. But as of right now, I'm using this T-Expert, T-Expert, whatever, however you pronounce it. Crystal clear. This is kind of by far the best resin I've ever used. For a couple of reasons. The cost isn't very bad at all. It's not the cheapest, but it's very much on the cheaper side as far as resins on Amazon. But the clarity and the yellowing resistance, because resin will tend to yellow over time, especially like this, for example, is resin from the Epoxy Resin store. It's called Platinum Clear Resin. I used to use that quite a bit, but over time, as you can see, my part B really yellowed, and that has started to affect any projects I use with that. So I no longer use that with anything transparent. I only use that resin with something I'm going to be using mica powder, something opaque. But in addition to being clearer and yellow resistant, this T-Expert, whatever resin is very bubble resistant. It's the best resin I've ever used as far as preventing bubbles. Unless you're really just mixing up a storm real hard, there's pretty minimal bubbles in that resin. So I gotta say, I love it. That's kind of my go-to now, is the T-Expert, whatever. I don't know how they want it pronounced or whatever. I've never really watched an ad or anything from them, so I don't know how they pronounce their company, but whatever. That's the resin I use. I love it. Couldn't recommend it more. Now, I don't know if they make smaller bottles of that. If they do, I would recommend that if you're just starting out. But either way, if you're just starting out with resin, I always kind of would recommend something a 32 ounce or less kit, because you may find that maybe you find the process too tedious, maybe you just don't like it, it's just a passing fad, maybe you don't really want to continue doing a bunch of resin work, or maybe you just have one single project you have in mind that you want to use resin for. Obviously, don't buy the gallon. Even though the gallon is cheaper per milliliter, that really doesn't help you if you only use it for one small project and then you've got most of a gallon of resin left just sitting there that you're never going to use, because that's just wasteful. So if you're just starting out, you just want to kind of dip your toes in it, go for a smaller kit. I guess the final thing would be mold care, and I briefly touched on this with the baby wipes. After each use, even if you don't have any little bits of resin stuck on there, it's always a good idea to go back over it with a baby wipe. Or, sometimes I'll hit it with the old spritz of alcohol, and then kind of wipe that up with a paper towel, and then hit it with a baby wipe for really stubborn molds. But you really want to make sure you clean your molds after each use, because the residue can build up, and also you want to avoid wear and tear on your molds. You don't want to so say I'm popping bubbles on this pumpkin here. I don't want to dig down in there, because if I poke into this mold, that blemish is going to be forever on any project I make with this mold now, and it's going to be kind of ruined. So you don't want to use any hard pointy tools. You don't want to damage your mold in any way, because that little mark, the scratch or cut or whatever, is going to translate into every piece you make with that mold from then on. So you want to take care of your molds. Baby wipes are a great idea for that. You just take a baby wipe, it's already moist, you just wipe it out. Now again, if you're going to use a baby wipe, there is water content in that, so you want to let your mold thoroughly dry after wiping it with a baby wipe. But again, keep your molds clean. And also in general, if you really want to get into making stuff and you've got the money, buy a plethora of molds, all shapes and sizes. You know, think about things that you might want to make in the future, and buy molds for that. I've got a lot of molds that I've never even used because, you know, wishful thinking, but I might get around to using them. It's always good to have a nice solid arsenal of resources and options for making whatever might pop into your head to make. And again, keep your molds clean, keep your measuring cups clean. And also, it's good advice to keep your workstation clean, keep everything organized. That's all basic common sense. So, with all that said, sorry that this video turned out quite long, but I wanted to get as comprehensive with all of this as I could. Hopefully I didn't over-explain everything, but I feel like when I was a beginner, I had to kind of surf through a lot of YouTube videos to kind of get all of the knowledge, because, and I'm certain even in this video, there's going to be gaps in even just basic knowledge of working with resin. But I tried to be as comprehensive and thorough as I could without making the video hours long. So anyway, hope you enjoyed the video, and have a great day.